Not every revolution announces itself with noise. Some arrive quietly, without crowds, without manifestos, without even a name remembered. In the 17th century, while Europe was burning with wars, faith, and spectacle, while churches demanded grandeur and painters filled canvases with movement, violence, and divine drama, one man chose to do something almost unthinkable. He removed the noise, he dimmed the light, and he let silence speak. His name was Georges de la Tour. You will not find him at the center of dramatic art histories filled with scandal and chaos. You will not hear stories of duels, exile, or wild genius spiraling into madness. Instead, you will find something far more unsettling: stillness. A single candle, a lowered gaze, a moment so quiet that it feels as if the world itself has paused. At first glance, his paintings seem simple, almost too simple. A person sits in darkness. A flame glows softly. Nothing appears to be happening. But the longer you look, the more uncomfortable the silence becomes. Because de la Tour was not painting action. He was painting thought, and thought is dangerous. To understand why Georges de la Tour matters, we must first understand the world he lived in. This was the Baroque age, an era obsessed with power, emotion, and spectacle. Painters were expected to impress, to overwhelm, to convince the viewer through drama and excess. Art was meant to move crowds. It was meant to serve kings, churches, and authority. Light was used to dazzle. Movement was used to control attention. Noise was everywhere. And yet, in the middle of this visual chaos, Georges de la Tour did the opposite. He painted people who were alone, people who were thinking, people who were not performing for anyone. His saints do not preach. They do not gesture wildly. They do not call for witnesses. They sit, they reflect. They exist in a space where faith is private, where meaning is internal, and where truth does not require an audience. This was radical, because silence cannot be controlled the way spectacle can. And what makes this even more extraordinary is that de la Tour was not painting for fame. He lived far from major artistic centers. He did not chase patrons across Europe. He did not surround himself with disciples. He stayed. He watched. He survived war, famine, and destruction. His town burned. His world collapsed more than once. And through all of it, he continued to paint the same way, quietly. When he died in 1652, almost nothing happened. No great funeral, no immediate legacy. And then something incredible occurred. He vanished. For nearly 3 centuries, his name disappeared from art history. His paintings were misattributed. His identity dissolved into shadows. The world moved on, loudly, confidently, certain that it had catalogued all its great minds. But silence has patience, and eventually it returns. When Georges de la Tour was rediscovered in the 20th century, art historians were stunned. Not because his work was dramatic, but because it was unchanged. It spoke to modern viewers just as powerfully as it had spoken to those who lived in candlelight centuries before. Because silence ages well. And that is why we are here, not to watch spectacle, not to admire noise, but to understand a man who proved that art does not need to shout to change how we see the world. So stay, dim the noise, and let us step into the candlelight of Georges de la Tour, where nothing seems to happen, and yet everything does. Georges de la Tour was born in 1593 in the small town of Vic-sur-Seine in France. Unlike many famous artists, he did not live in Rome. He did not study in major artistic centers. He stayed close to home. This isolation shaped everything. Very little is known about his personal life. Few letters survived. Few documents mention him. What we do know is this: he lived through war, famine, and plague. His town was burned during the 30 Years' War, and he rebuilt his life more than once. Silence was not a choice for him. it was reality. In the 17th century, light was never neutral. Painters did not simply use light to illuminate objects. They used it to control emotion, to guide belief, to impress churches, kings, and crowds. Baroque art thrived on excess. Dramatic gestures, exploding movement, divine light pouring from the heavens. Light was loud, and then came Georges de la Tour. He did something radical. He took the grand divine light of Baroque painting and reduced it to a single candle, one flame. No angels, no glowing skies, no dramatic heavens opening above human suffering, just fire, fragile and temporary. This was not a technical limitation. It was a philosophical choice. In de la Tour's paintings, the candle is never decorative. It is the center of meaning. The flame defines what exists and what disappears into darkness. Everything outside its reach is denied importance. In most Baroque works, light overwhelms the viewer. In de la Tour's work, light invites the viewer inward. His figures are often caught in moments of stillness, not praying loudly, not performing faith, but contemplating it. Faces are calm, eyes are lowered, hands are steady. The candlelight does not dramatize emotion, it slows it down. And this changes everything, because candlelight is human. It flickers, it weakens, it can be extinguished at any moment. By choosing candlelight, de la Tour rejected the idea of absolute eternal illumination. Instead, he painted truth as something fragile, temporary, and deeply personal. This was revolutionary. In an age when the church used art to assert certainty, de la Tour painted uncertainty. In a time when power demanded spectacle, he painted restraint. Even the way he hides the flame matters. Often the candle is partially covered by a hand or an object, forcing the light to bounce indirectly across faces. This creates softness instead of intensity. It suggests that truth is not revealed all at once. It must be approached slowly, quietly. This approach was deeply unsettling to the world he lived in, because silence cannot be commanded and introspection cannot be controlled. De la Tour's candlelight scenes remove hierarchy. Saints look like peasants. Biblical figures resemble ordinary people. The divine is no longer above humanity. It sits beside it, in the dark. And this is why his work feels modern, because we still live in a world overwhelmed by noise, by spectacle, by constant illumination. And yet, de la Tour reminds us that meaning often appears only when the light is reduced, when distractions fade, when silence returns. His candlelight revolution was not about technique. It was about how humans encounter truth, not through shock, not through fear, but through quiet attention. And that may be the most radical artistic statement of all. In the Baroque world, religion was rarely quiet. Churches demanded awe, paintings demanded submission. Faith was staged as spectacle, full of angels descending from the sky, muscles straining, faces contorted by ecstasy or pain. Sacred art was designed to overwhelm. And then came Georges de la Tour. He removed the spectacle, he removed the drama, and in doing so, he redefined what holiness could look like. In de la Tour's sacred scenes, nothing explodes into motion. No divine light floods the room. No angels interrupt the moment. Instead, we see a woman sitting quietly, a man holding a candle, a saint lost in thought. At first, these scenes appear almost ordinary. That is the shock. De la Tour portrays biblical figures as people you could meet in silence, not as being separated from humanity by divine force. Mary Magdalene does not weep theatrically. Saint Joseph does not command attention. They sit, they think, they wait. This was deeply unconventional, because the church relied on emotional impact to guide belief. Drama was a tool of persuasion. But de la Tour chose restraint, and restraint shifts power. By removing theatrical gestures, he forces the viewer to slow down. There is no visual instruction on what to feel. no dramatic cue. Meaning must be discovered, not delivered. In many of his paintings, the sacred moment is almost indistinguishable from a private one. A saint resembles a peasant. A holy scene resembles a quiet evening. The divine is not above the human. It sits beside it. And this changes the relationship between viewer and faith. Because when holiness is quiet, it becomes personal. De la Tour's saints do not perform belief, they inhabit it. Their expressions are neutral, their movements minimal. Emotion is internal. This approach suggests something radical for its time, that spiritual truth does not require noise, that faith can exist without fear or spectacle, that contemplation is as sacred as revelation. In a century marked by religious conflict, this was a dangerous idea, because spectacle is easy to control, silence is not. De la Tour's sacred scenes invite private reflection, not public obedience. They offer no clear hierarchy, no visual dominance, only presence. And this is why his religious paintings feel modern. They do not demand belief, they allow it. By stripping sacred art of drama, de la Tour did not weaken its power. He concentrated it. Like candlelight in darkness, meaning becomes stronger when everything unnecessary is removed. When Georges de la Tour died in 1652, there was no moment of recognition, no final acknowledgement that history was losing something rare. The world did not stop. There were no grand funerals attended by artists or scholars, no immediate effort to preserve his name, no urgent sense that a unique voice had just fallen silent. Instead, life moved on, wars continued, art changed, new styles replaced old ones, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, Georges de la Tour vanished, not dramatically, not violently, but quietly. His paintings remained, hanging in churches, private homes, and collections, yet detached from the man who created them. They were attributed to others, to Caravaggio, to Dutch masters, to anonymous hands that history found easier to categorize. His name faded not because his work lacked power, but because it lacked noise. In an art world that remembered spectacle, silence was easy to overlook. For nearly 300 years, de la Tour existed without existing. His paintings were seen but not understood, admired but misread. The candlelight remained, the stillness endured, yet no one asked the most important question: who painted this silence? And this is where the story becomes unsettling, because forgetting de la Tour was not an accident. It was a reflection of how history works. History does not preserve what is quiet. It preserves what demands attention. Artists who shocked, rebelled, or scandalized were remembered. Artists who whispered were absorbed into the background. De la Tour's work did not fit into easy narratives. It was not dramatic enough for Baroque excess, nor expressive enough for later Romanticism. So it slipped through the cracks. It took the modern world, a world exhausted by noise, to finally recognize what had been lost. In the early 20th century, art historians began to notice something strange. Certain paintings scattered across Europe shared the same stillness, the same candlelit restraint, the same human quiet. They did not behave like other Baroque works. They resisted classification, and slowly, patiently, connections were drawn. Signatures were rediscovered. Documents were re-examined. Archives were reopened. A name resurfaced: Georges de la Tour. What followed was not an explosion of fame, but something far more meaningful: recognition. As exhibitions were organized and paintings reunited under his name, viewers were stunned, not because the works felt old, but because they felt contemporary. In a century shaped by speed, distraction, and spectacle, de la Tour's paintings felt like resistance. They asked nothing of the viewer except time. They offered no drama, no instruction, no emotional manipulation, only presence. And that is when the true irony emerged. The painter who had been forgotten because he was too quiet was rediscovered precisely because the world had grown too loud. His silence, once invisible, became necessary. Today, Georges de la Tour is no longer lost, but his story remains a warning. That genius can disappear without protest, that history can overlook what does not shout, and that rediscovery often says more about us than about the artist himself. Because de la Tour did not change. We did. We finally learned how to listen. In the end, the light that defines Georges de la Tour is not a light that blinds, not a light that overwhelms, and not a light that demands obedience. It is a light that waits, a small flame, fragile and temporary, quietly resisting the darkness around it, not by force but by presence. This is what makes de la Tour different from so many artists of his time. He did not paint light as power. He painted light as awareness. In a century where art was used to command belief, to intimidate the viewer with divine authority and theatrical certainty, de la Tour chose something far more difficult. He chose restraint. His candlelight does not burn away doubt. It does not promise absolute truth. It simply reveals enough to think. And perhaps that is why his work feels so relevant today, because we live in a world flooded with light, screens glowing endlessly, images shouting for attention, truths delivered instantly and loudly, and yet meaning feels increasingly distant. De la Tour understood something that modern life often forgets. That illumination without reflection is empty. His figures sit in silence because silence is where understanding begins. They do not perform faith. They do not dramatize emotion. They exist in a moment where the external world has been reduced to allow the internal world to emerge. This is not weakness, it is courage. Because quiet cannot be forced on an audience. It must be chosen. And by choosing candlelight over spectacle, de la Tour trusted the viewer. He trusted that someone, somewhere, would slow down enough to meet his work halfway. That trust was not rewarded immediately. He was forgotten, misunderstood, absorbed into other names, other narratives, other histories. But time has a way of correcting what noise distorts. And when his paintings were finally seen clearly again, they did not feel outdated, they felt necessary. Because the light that does not burn does not destroy what it touches. It preserves. It allows complexity. It makes room for doubt, for thought, for humanity. Georges de la Tour did not try to dominate the viewer. He invited them. And that invitation still stands. Every time we look into one of his candlelit scenes, we are reminded that not all truths arrive loudly, that not all revolutions are visible, and that some of the most powerful ideas survive precisely because they refuse to shout. His light does not burn empires, it does not crown kings, it does not rewrite history overnight. It endures, quietly, and in that endurance, it teaches us something essential, that art does not need to overwhelm the world to change the way we see it. Sometimes it only needs a single flame and the patience to wait for someone willing to look. In a world that never stops shining, Georges de la Tour reminds us that the most meaningful light is the one that does not burn,